Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining in. This session is about 4 things businesses must do before the DPDP rules hit. So I'm Pushkal. I'm the head of consent infrastructure at Leegality. In this session, we also have Pooja. Pooja is a corporate lawyer with over 11 years of experience advising MNCs on global data privacy laws. She helps businesses build the right strategy to safeguard their assets under various international regulations, and she's currently working at Protivit as a legal manager for global data privacy law. We also have Shreya. She has more than 7 years of experience leading the implementation of the data privacy for TVS group entities. She's been working closely on managing compliance under various privacy laws, including the DPDP Act, and she specializes in safeguarding both personal and organizational data. Pooja, Shreya, thank you so much for coming in. Towards the end of the session, we will also have Siddhant, who's the head of product at Leegality, to come in and show you a demo about how we can help you. Thank you so much, Pooja and Shreya, for being able to join us.
Pleasure is ours. Thank you.
Great. Let's first talk about why we are having this session. Right. So today we will go over why businesses need to get started, and we'll talk about some actionable points, some key things, 4 things that businesses can do to become compliant. But first, why we are having this session, right? So we've been talking to a lot of companies in the consumer goods space, and many are starting now, but for many other people, they want to wait for the rules, right? But the key requirements are all there in the law, and the minister is also pushing companies to begin preparation. There right now seems to be an expectation that the heavy compliance obligations will fall only upon the regulated entities like banks and financial services. However, the regulatory tide is already turning towards ensuring data protection compliance across all sectors, especially also in the consumer goods sector, for example, for e-commerce and D2C and retail and manufacturing companies as well. So on the screen, you see all the regulatory activity that has been happening. Right? You have the DPDP Act, of course, and the draft rules as well. But in that time, you also have the guidelines of prevention and regulation of dark patterns, the dark pattern rules that come in that talk about explicit and affirmative consent. And then after the draft rules come out, the CCPA, which is the Central Consumer Protection Authority, not to be confused with the California law, but the CCPA has come out and said that you have to do these self audits for compliance with these rules. And they've made a special reference to the consent requirements in the e-commerce rules. So the NEGD BRD has come out, TRI has come out with the digital consent acquisition, which applies to telemarketing across the board, right? You already see that even within the consumer space, there is a heavy push for consent and all of these aspects, right? In fact, if you look at a recent case, Pankaj Changotia versus Tea Leaf and Coffee Bean, right? This came up in front of the Chandigarh SDRC. And here, a practice that all of us would be familiar with. This guy went to a cafe, and the people at the cafe asked for his number and without that, he couldn't get the coffee or the bill. And after he gave his number, he started getting all these promotional messages and calls and all of that. And when this came up in front of the SDRC, they said that express consent should be taken. Right? And this itself is a very big move already that is happening towards consent. And consent is like step 3 or 4 of the process, right? There are several steps that go into operationalizing consents within the organization, within any organization, right? And today is about discussing that. So let's have a look at what goes into collecting consent, right? So what you're seeing on your screen is a rough timeline of about 72 weeks, which is something that we have prepared in consultation with several large businesses. And the initial period would involve data discovery, your gap assessments, and your third-party risk assessments, right? And today we are going to talk about these 3-4 topics and demystify them and try to give you some clear takeaways from the session about how you can get started with DPDP compliance today, right? Important to start now. And if you don't, you would run the risk of running into a hurried implementation for such a sensitive and extensive regime that touches all these business functions. With this, I'll pull in Pooja. You're working with so many companies on data protection compliance, and you've already gone through this journey. with GDPR and CCPA and all of that. What do you think about this wait and watch approach that businesses are following these days? Have you seen this in organizations? And why should DPDP compliance be a priority for an organization today?
That's a very good question to start with, Pushkar. In my experience, most of the time, the organization, as you correctly said, it's a wait and watch approach, is what is going on. But it's very important for the organizations to understand that compliance isn't built overnight. Just like how you showed the graph right now, trust me, it takes sometimes even more than a year. It all depends on the type of data that you're processing, the volumes of data that you're processing, the channels that are bringing in the data. So I think it's very important that there should not be a time lag, because today every organization is a data organization, I believe. I call every organization a data company. They collect so much amount of data, correct? So the delay is going to act like a ticking bomb, to be honest. So it's very important to understand that there are many factors that are need to be considered while you're doing the assessments, the gap assessments, the discovery, because the discovery mapping across needs to be done across all the departments. You need to renegotiate the old contracts with the third parties, because most of the time they are very reluctant that we've already signed the contracts, we don't want to sign the new DPAs. We've seen that happening. You have to change the entire culture of the team. The staff needs to be trained. You have to redesign sometimes the consent flows. You have to clean up the legacy systems. You have to test the breach protocols if they're working well, setting up organ. There's so many factors that are involved, and organization do not realize that. They think that there are just some check boxes they have to tick mark and we will be done, but that's not the case. I will give you a very live example. The current client that I'm working with, it's a multi conglomerate. It's a global organization in entertainment and news industry. Initially when we decided the scope of work, it had come up to the 10 weeks of timeline, and now it has gone beyond 10 months. That's because they didn't know that they're sitting on so much data. They didn't know so many silo systems are there, silo applications are there, so many channels that they are collecting data from. So this happens once you do the assessment, you realize that you're sitting on so much data, right? This is one factor that you should not delay, because it's like I said, it's going to act like a ticking bomb. Second is, right now, as what I believe, market trust is important, given that the privacy factor has come in. Because I understand that India is in a nascent stage to understand, even because when we sit down across the CXOs also, they are not aware as to what is personal data, what is this data privacy. Of course, the regulated industry are much aware than the other industries, but yes, that's the situation today. So it's important that they, if it's a startup, then they build that market trust, say, showing that they have privacy in place. So it should act as a business enabler for them. And then if it's an old company, then they should safeguard that decade long trust that they have built. I'll just give one example. It's a very famous case between Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. I'm sure most of them have heard, if you fall into this industry, that Cambridge had used Facebook's data and had harvested around 80 to 90 million of data without taking proper consent for political advertising. And what had happened is there was a huge breach. And because of the leak of the data, Facebook had to pay close to around billions. Like I think it's 4 to 5 billions the amount goes to. It had to pay that amount to US FTC. And not just that, Facebook is now any which way is infamous for the regulatory scrutiny that is going on, right? Post that. So you are like entering the door for the regulators to scrutiny your organization. So it's very important to make sure that you are starting in time. And given DPDP Act, if I have to talk about, then I think it's high time now, because you will not get enough time, because you've had ample of time to look at the act, which has come in 2023, and I think a good close to more than 6 months to act even on the rules for that matter. That's it.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, you spoke about some very interesting facts, right? One part was that there are so many unknowns. You can start off thinking about a 10-week timeline, but by the time you get into it, you realize that it'll go into 10 months. And the second part that you touched upon was also a people problem. Like you have to talk to so many people and so many departments, work together with them, because it touches all of these business functions, right? And typically, when you're dealing with unknown things, when you're dealing with people problems, they do take longer. So it's not just about a checklist. And yeah, you also touched upon privacy as a competitive advantage, and how, and we also discussed that case where people are beginning to demand some basic privacy controls, and that poses a clear business risk other than the legal risk, of course. Very interesting points about the unknownness and the people problem here, and all of us have a legal background here. So with that, I have to move to Shreya to ask, what role do you think in-house compliance teams can play within an organization to sensitize business, marketing, and product teams to start moving towards compliance? How can a compliance person within this organization bring that about internally?
Yeah, thanks, Pushkar. So what I would like to start with what Pooja has already commented on, the checklist versus the due diligence, because that is the core principle of how you drive a privacy program even within the organization. That mindset shift is what we actually work with when you want to implement something within the organization, because that's where many organizations they stumble. They go with the checklist approach. They say, okay, yes, we have a privacy policy, yes, we got the consent, but due diligence might ask you to answer the harder questions, which is the policy actually being followed? Is the consent meaningful? Is it hidden in a pre-ticked checkbox? Because those are all the things which can make you easily fall in a trap. Under DPDP as well, the regulators, customers, they will look beyond your paperwork. So that's where you have to make that mindset shift, start the awareness, start the trainings, etc., for people to understand that this is not just a checklist activity. Whatever you're going to implement, it's going to have huge impact on how you are showcasing your readiness for any regulation for that matter, not just DPDPA. And the critical point, like you mentioned, how to get the buy-in from business, product, and engineering. It's such a great point, because if privacy, it stays in I like to call it a legal silo, it fails. And in my discussions with various industry leaders across multiple conferences, we have also seen that the way to get the buy-in is to speak the language of the team. You need to learn as a lawyer, even if you're a lawyer or you're from the compliance side, you need to learn that language. Like, for instance, if you're speaking to product and engineering team, you don't go in with legal jargons. You say with, okay, if we design the consent right now, you won't have to re-engineer the product later. So what it does is it lands because they understand the time and work and effort that might be required for them to implement it, right? Similarly, you can approach the business teams. You have to frame it as a trust and reputation issue when you're discussing the same with your business teams. Simply speak the language. The customer might walk away faster from a trust breach than a pricing issue. For marketing, you have showcasing the clear and transparent consent can actually increase the customer engagement instead of scaring people away. We have recently seen so many ads coming from different organizations where they are prioritizing to showcase that we are the privacy champions, like we will protect your data, and they are using it as a great marketing strategy. I will say kudos to their team because they're speaking the language of why it needs to be not just a compliance check, right? With leadership, this is what we have also seen is that there is always a risk and cost that the leadership needs to understand, right? The fines, the reputational damage, the regulatory scrutiny, that is the language that will help you to bring in. So generally it's with leaderships, we go with ROI. What is the return of investment if I go and set up a program, if I do all these things which is required by the law? So when you're getting the buy-in, when you want to get the buy-in, you have to speak the language of your stakeholder. You cannot just limit yourself saying, no, this is a compliance check, you have to do it, this is a legal requirement, because for them, they need to understand their case law. How is it impacting their business or their domain or their function? So to sum up, what we have also seen in discussions and in working is that running practical scenarios for teams definitely helps. Like Pooja rightly mentioned, you discuss scenarios. For example, suppose a customer asks for deleting their data. What would your team do today? So that makes them think about it as a problem statement rather than an imposition on them to drive something. So when they take the ownership of it, that changes the ownership of the activity in general, like who's responsible for it and who's accountable for it.
Yeah. Fantastic. So yeah, for each function, you talked about how they stand to benefit by implementing privacy and the risks that their specific function faces if they don't. And the practicality point that you touched upon is critical, right? So when a product engineering team is thinking about tech debt and they want to reduce that tech debt, the best way to do that right now is to bake in privacy into your implementation. And for a business, if you make the brand, you make it about the brand and the reputation associated with the brand, that is when it becomes relevant. And you also talked about the higher management. So yeah, these are all, it is not just a legal or compliance problem, and it must be communicated. It should not be communicated as one. It is a business problem for sure. And we had a question about whether there is a predefined list of purposes. There's a predefined list of purposes that are there. And actually, no, there is no predefined list of purposes in most cases, because businesses are so different and data processing is structured so differently. Right? So, for example, let's have a look this flow that's in front of us right now. It's about a sale of a vehicle where a customer raises a query on the website, which goes to the dealership, which also gets forwarded to the OEM, and then the PII may be shared with lending partners if the customer takes loan. It may be shared with insurance partners, and then finally the FASTag partner as well. So there's so many, and this is just a simplified flow, but there are so many people involved in each flow, and each of those flows is bespoke. So with these flows, definitely first point is that you cannot have predefined flows. And secondly, how do you get started? But before I get to how do you get started, we have some more interesting questions here. This one's for you. Business, and Pooja, I think, please, you also come in. Business teams don't like the friction that consents add. So you face a lot of pushback in adding consent layers. And I think we've already spoken about privacy as a business advantage. So could you take this question, please?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to now focus, since I've already touched upon the impact of how we can get the business buy-in. Now the question is, how do you do it? You need to start to sit early into these discussions when your product and engineering teams are designing we call it the product requirement document, right? You need not be just the lawyer who's coming in and saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. You need to sit with them and collectively, like in collaboration, find a solution. For instance, as a legal person, I know that section 4, it asks me to have a lawful purpose, but I have to communicate this and discuss this with my business team to make them understand this, what is the actual requirement coming out of it. So what I will say is that if we build a clear consent flow now, you won't have to rebuild the app later, because here's a mock-up of what a good consent design might look like. So rather than me going and telling them, no, there needs to be a lawful purpose, and then they're wondering, okay, what is this lawful purpose she's talking about? I'll say, okay, let's just define the consent into these segments. This is my legal requirement. This is what you need to do, implement in the design. And this is what the government is expecting, even from their own bodies. If you see the recent consent management document that is being circulating around, they have clearly specified how to implement consent, what is going to be called as a verifiable consent. So there are so many resources available, so many design inputs that you can sit with, but you need to sit with them to understand feasibility of each solution that you're presenting, right? So that's one thing. And again, as I said, with business, you talk their language. So you say that this is a privacy breach, it can cost you X percentage of your customer churn, right? Or it takes Y months for you to recover the trust that you have developed over a period of time. And that translates compliance into a business impact, right? So now they understand, okay, this is the impact that is going to be created on my business in general. So when we deal with those kind of teams, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just legal sitting outside and giving the final suggestions and advice. It is a collaborative effort. If you're part of an organization, you have to sit with the teams, understand their problems, and come up with the solutions together.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when we also, as a consent solution provider, we deal with this question a lot, where we are constantly spending every day trying to make our UI more and more optimized. Not having a consent pop-up is not an option. What you need to work upon between legal business and product is to how to make it very seamless, how to set up the right analytics to make sure that you can constantly improvise while at the same time ensuring watertight compliance. The importance of collaboration is relevant there also. There's one more question, but I think that'll be better taken at the end, towards the end, when we talk about third parties. So let's move to how do you get started, right? We've all heard about the term gap assessments. And whenever we think of a gap assessment, we think of this voluminous report with itemized observations, and it's a bit inaccessible and difficult to understand. So I want to bring in Pooja here. And Pooja, from your bird's eye view of the industry, how does this gap assessment and data discovery across all of these scattered data sources, how does this actually work? And what do you see the challenges? What are the challenges that you see here? And practically, can you give us some practical insights about how data discovery and gap assessment would fit into an organization? What sort of a timeline they can expect? What would be their first steps towards starting something like this, and what are the challenges they can expect? Can you give us an overview around that?
Sure. Thank you. First, initiate any step towards having a correct data privacy posture is to have the assessment done. I'll come on the challenges, I'll touch base in the middle. But first and foremost, it's important that you should know what is there in your organization. What are you sitting on? What are you holding up together, right? So we often think that the compliance is all about what is in the official systems and or the active systems or the active applications, right? But breach rarely comes from the known data set. Breach always happens where you've missed looking at all those stuff. So that is the toughest challenge, to find the data you don't know that really exist. So assessment may the data discovery is the most important and crucial part. So biggest challenge is this only, that the organizations underestimate that there is any shadow data in the system. So I call this a iceberg problem. So you know how the iceberg looks, right? So under over the water, you see that small tip, and the organizations think that yes, this is the data what we see. But actually, there's a huge mountain and chunk of data that they are sitting on and they're not aware of. So that's the biggest challenge. And this was also recorded in one of the Gartner study recently, where they said that 20% of the data is the known data to the organization. 80% they later on come to know that, oh, after doing the complete data discovery, understanding all the channels that are coming in, the data that is coming in, or the data that's been stored in silos, or the data, like, for example, the forgotten legacy ERP logs, or the old spreadsheets used by the department, the shared drives, or the campaign data dump, or the research department's data, because they also use data sets which they are experimenting or through different ways, depending on what sector they are researching on. So there's lot of data sets I can keep talking about, which is not really visible to the senior stakeholders as the employee keeps churning, right? So the senior stakeholders don't know what are the data sets that the older employees have worked on. So I think that is the biggest challenge that they have to work on, and very important step that they can take towards is to have a data discovery done. Now, how you can do that is, of course, there are many ways you can do it. One is that you start first inventorizing what data every department has, start mapping that across cross functionally, and keep in mind that this is not a one time activity. You can't say that, okay, I've done the data discovery, now I'm done with it and I'm complied. No, you have to keep doing that periodically, right? For example, there's a Uber case that I can quote here, where they missed inventorizing the developers database, and they had to pay close to 150 millions in settlement across 50 US states because they missed out the data which was there lying of the drivers and the riders in the developers database. It's very important firstly to do the assessment. Then second, you can of course take help of the automated discovery tools which are there in market today. This can be used. See, manual data discovery is possible, but if you have volumes of data that's churning in your business, then you need to take help of those automated discovery tools. Third, what Shreya had also mentioned, that if you could have that department wise workshops and make them realize that why it is critical for them to let people know, or the stakeholders know, that what is the data that they are actually using. Then, because not everybody at the top knows what you are working or dealing with, right? Then lastly, what I can say is that data stewards really help. So I also discovered this in a very funny way, that one of the organization had it that in their policy that they need to have a data champion for every department, especially the business department, because they are the ones who do not disclose to the DPOs that we have started collecting this additional chunk of data, which should be actually disclosed in their privacy policies, but they do not. So these data stewards or the champions should be made responsible for any changes that happens, and to be also informed to the, I mean, they need to also inform to the data privacy officers, so that you know that there's one person looking over every department to see that any data that's been used in addition to what we're actually disclosing to the users. So just to sum it up again, the real risk, very important, the organizations do not understand this, is that does not come from the known data. It always comes from the unknown data. So have your data discovery done in the first stage. And just to answer that one question of yours, what you said that how long it may take. So looking at, I mean, based on my experience, what I've seen is the assessment may take, say, 2 to 3 months, but the implementation takes more than 8 to 10 months also, because the gaps that have come out of assessment that you need to fix up may take more time. So I think that's, and if you are thinking that the DPDP rules will come out and will quickly fix those things, that's not how it works. There are a lot of things, like I earlier said, that one has to work on. And maybe each domain that I called out in my previous answer may take 1 month itself for each of the domains to be fixed. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Very interesting, really practical stuff. You talked about why data discovery is important and where it fits in. You need to first understand what data is in what system. And that is when you can start assigning sort of compliance aspects, such as what are the processing activities and what are the purposes for which it is being processed. So that under the surface data needs to first be unearthed. And then once you've unearthed it, you need to start asking people, okay, what are you doing with this? And then you went on to talk about the need for data stewards or data champions, which is a very interesting concept. Again, a people solution to a people problem, right? You have to talk to so many departments within an organization, and there is a need for an interdepartmental, interdisciplinary approach to this. There are the standard practice, the best practice internationally is to set up privacy committees within organizations, and the whole point is to get all departments to come together. So setting up a data person, data champion within each department who speaks the language of that department and takes up the ownership for that department is another amazing idea. And also, finally, once the gap assessment is done, yeah, sure, it is about data mapping, and data mapping is what feeds into the rest of your governance operation, but it's also about fixing the gaps. And these gaps are not trivial. They take a long time to fix. So these really practical points coming from you. Shreya, what about you? Do you have what practical strategies do you think are relevant as a compliance person within an organization when you're looking at data mapping, when you're looking at a gap assessment? What practical strategies can you suggest for our audience here?
Yeah, thanks, Pushkal. Going with data discovery, data mapping, as rightly pointed out by Pooja, the core of all of this is to understand the data ownership. Where does the data actually belongs to? And in many of my discussions with the industry and leaders, what we have seen is many startups and smaller companies, for them, data ownership can feel like a luxury, something they'll get to later when they are bigger. So right now it's just a small data set. Maybe I have full ownership on it. I'll get to it when I'm bigger. But in reality, it's absolutely critical to establish it early on, as rightly mentioned by Pooja. Because here's why: if nobody owns that data, then nobody feels accountable for it. That means that data keeps piling up without purpose, without the retention rules, which are getting ignored. And then when a customer asks where the data they want it to be deleted, no one knows who's responsible for even deleting it. Under DPDP Act, company as a data fiduciary, I'm hoping everybody is now familiar with that term. So in India, we are calling them data fiduciary. It is the one that is accountable. But internally, you need clear ownership to make these compliance real and not just on paper requirements, right? If that's missing, you risk fines, but most importantly, you risk losing the overall core of your customer trust. And now you talked about how to practical, like any practical aspects of it, right? And I think Pooja touched up on those aspects. So where to begin? First of all, as she rightly mentioned, you start assigning the data owners by functions. You start that. So HR owns employee data, sales owns lead data, finance owns billing data, marketing maybe campaign data, right? It doesn't need to have a new role. You just need to clarify it and record it. Next is you can also go with the technology side of things, right? Link the ownership to systems. So whoever is owning my CRM system is also responsible for my customer data and how it is collected, updated, and deleted if the need comes to that system, like if the data is generated by that system. And you mentioned, you can, if you're a smaller company, you can simply start by documenting it, even a one-page sheet listing. This is the data type, this is my system, this is my owner. That's where you can simply start on an Excel sheet. But when you grow, you need to obviously, because of the volume of data, the sharing of data within functions for different purposes, there needs to be a clear mapping done around it. That's where even data flow diagrams come very handy to give you the complete end-to-end journey of where the data touch point is, where you are actually collecting it, who all have access to it during the course of its journey in the organization, finally where it lands. That also helps your security controls to be in place for data discovery. Suppose I say, okay, this is my data discovery. Now I've identified where all my data is residing. Next step is ownership of that data. Then you start mapping that data. Finally, you generate a data flow diagram. Once you reach the data flow diagram level is where you can then decide the security controls, like what you need to be in place. Now that comes in when obviously the act and the rules and the later stages, but you need to start identifying these things right now: the ownership, the discovery, and the mapping. That's what
Very
I
interesting. Yeah, very interesting. And I think you spoke about, how in an organization this can work out in a step-by-step way. Like we have the theory, of course, but like hearing from you about exactly practically how an organization can coordinate to make it happen
Yeah.
is super duper relevant. We also had a
In
question.
fact,
Yeah,
sorry. Let me just add a real world scenario. It just reminded me. I was just in a discussion few weeks back in a conference with a young startup. Okay. They were only about like 12, 15 individuals who thought that they had full customer control, data control, because everything was in their main CRM. But when during the course of our discussion, we were trying to see, okay, if you believe it is only in CRM, what about the email list, which is sitting on the laptops? What about the payment data, which might be in an Excel sheet in a folder? If you're a small startup and you're sharing details through WhatsApp, what happens there? Do we have control over there? And some leads are even stored in your free trial tools that we see small industries taking and leveraging on, right? So no one had identified those as also your sources of maybe identifying a breach source as well, right? So when your customer then finally asks, okay, I want my data deleted, you can't just delete it from the CRM and say it is done, because the law expects you to delete it from each database, each place where you have located it. So yeah, that's one practical thing I remembered which happened on the same topic.
this whole idea of creating this data flow diagram, and this data flow diagram being at the center of things, because if you're rigorous enough in creating this data flow diagram, that is when you get complete visibility, and that's when you understand the risk across each system, right? And that's where with the right ownership you can make sure that these risks are mitigated. So one of the questions in the chat about a breach of anonymized data, whether it is considered a personal data breach, if you're able to put the right security safeguards, then you can ensure that in the more sensitive data is not in the further away systems or in the low control system, and that way you can actually avoid a risk of data breach. So yeah, that's what a data mapping exercise really boils down to. It is the foundation of your compliance, right? It provides the necessary context for all your personal data so that you can comply with the act in a meaningful way. Your entire governance and security apparatus for use and storage and everything will be based on this data mapping, and provides the transparency and control that the act is offering. Yeah, really, I really like from both Pooja and Shreya, both of you, the practical aspects of how this works within an organization, because theoretically it may be easier to explain, but how does this work in a step-by-step way in an organization is, I think, a useful takeaway for a lot of people. So we've spoken about doing a data discovery, getting that visibility, right? What data do I have? Then we've spoken about assigning aspects like processing, what activities it's being used for, what purposes is it being used for, whose data is it? And once we do that, we've spoken about risk mitigation. Now, when we speak about risk mitigation, of course, internally, when you look at your internal systems, that's where you have the most control. Shreya, as you mentioned, you have that system. Can we go to the next slide, please? So that's where, when you look at your internal systems, your own apps, your own systems, that's where you have the most control. You can have these owners, you can follow up with these owners, you have a clear system of accountability, right? But when it comes to third parties, they become your biggest risk. So let's talk about third parties. So far, and this is a question for Pooja. Pooja, so far in the unregulated sector, there's a notion that, okay, I've handed my data to a third party, which means it's not my risk anymore. It's upon the third party to ensure that they handle the data properly. And the contracts reflect this, that, okay, I've handed it over to you. It's not my problem. Now it's your problem. Does that work anymore? Will that change? DPDP regime comes in.
No, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pushkar. Very interestingly, I've seen whenever I speak to, especially the non-regulated industries, where they have this common misconception. They think that outsourcing the data and if somebody else is processing is like offloading the liability, which is not the case. So whichever entity, it's very important for the organization to get this thing very clear that every alternate day or two, we get these emails giving us a scenario where they'll talk about how they are passing on the data to this third entity and they are processing it. How come we are liable? So it's very important to understand that whichever entity which decides why and how is the data processed, this why and how of processing activity is liable for the safety of the data. So that's very important that they make this one point very clear because there are multiple examples I can give about the companies which have come in light, right? Because of the enormous penalties that are levied on them, where the hackers are infiltrating the systems of the third party, and through that, they get into the network of the principal company. So the data which is there in the data set of the third party so definitely goes, but it also comes to the principal that they also hack the principal company's network. So you lose on so much of data. That reminds me of a very famous case, and it's my favorite case because this was the most difficult situation for Marriott International to take care of. So what had happened is they thought so Marriott had acquired certain organization and an system from that organization was continued to be used. It was a legacy system called Starwood. And through that system, the hackers had hacked into Marriott International and their so you know what which industry Marriott International is into, and they even their rooms, right, the hotel rooms are accessed through digital cards. Trust me, they were actually asking for ransom. These hackers were asking for ransom from the Marriott International. And literally, their entire business had stopped because they couldn't even access those rooms because of the inactivity of that digital cards. The complete system were gone. So they had to, but they did not budge. They said that we're not going to give anything to these hackers who are asking for ransoms. They had completely shut down their operations for, I believe, more than weeks. This is a very interesting case one must go and look at. So vendor negligence can literally sink a principal company. So it's very important that see, sometimes the contracts needs to go beyond NDAs also. What we have seen is that third parties do not come and negotiate saying that we already have the non-disclosure clause. Why do you want to put in more clause? But it's very important that there should be privacy related clauses, which we see in the SCCs, which GDPR has talked about. Yes, like you asked, so vendors will be liable is a big misconception and the bubble has to be burst now, and nobody from the vendor, the regulator will not first catch hold of the vendor but you, because you handed over that data to the vendor. Second is now what you can do is for this, I believe you can have due diligence done of the vendors to see if they have past breaches, the kind of clients they have, or maybe the basic certifications. You can look at the SOC 2s or the ISO 27001 or 701 if they have, that's great. But post this due diligence, I think the DPAs, the data process, however you call it, the data processing agreement, data protection agreement, data privacy agreement, they are called by any names. So I believe there are three important buckets that you need to look into this contract. It's very important. I put them in three parts. One is the foundational clause, second is privacy clauses, third is risk allocation clauses. In foundation clauses, it's very critical that you need to define the scope of your transaction very clearly. Then comes the definition. We are properly attributing the definition to the correct owner. Who is the data fiduciary? Who is the data processor? What is the data that will be processed? And the lawful basis. This is also very crucial because you are limiting them to a certain bracket that yes, this is the only portion where you're going to work on and how you're going to process, which will be deemed as a lawful basis of processing a certain data. So these three, I believe, comes under the foundational clauses. Then comes the privacy clauses. So privacy clauses is nothing but how are they going to manage between the two parties the DSR management. So if there's a DSR request coming to the say the vendor, then how are they going to notify the principal company? So whatever arrangement they want to make, set it out clearly, list it out clearly in the contract. so that that's not missed on the part of vendor. And even if they miss it, you had set it out that they had to notify, and they will be responsible for missing that out. Retention or disposal clauses. Now, what is retention disposal clauses? Is nothing but how, post the termination of contract, how will you deal with the data? How are you going to give that data back to the principal company, and how you're closing, right? Or are you like going to dispose of the complete data set from systems and giving any certification? That's something you need to look at. The breach notification clauses. If the third party detects that yes, there was some breach or some activity they've found or some incident that has occurred, you have to set out time limit to the vendor company saying that you are going to notify that to me in, either on immediate basis or however that works out. Then I think security clauses is something what I have to look at. Then just going to take it briefly because I can go on talking on these clauses a lot. Then sub-processor is something very crucial where if the third party is hiring further another processor, which will be called as a sub-processor, they have to take a written permission from the principal. So that's, I believe, I'm going to stop with the privacy clauses. There can be more to it, but that's the second bucket of what I look into. One was the foundational privacy and risk allocation. This is something a lot of companies overlook into. The legal departments, if they actually play a role, I'm sure they're going to definitely touch base on this. Like the limitation of liability clause, where you're realistically setting up the liability caps, right? Or the indemnity which should cover the fines or the breach cost if happens. Confidentiality clause or termination clause and survival clause, mostly very important. That even if the contract is terminated, these important relocation clauses should survive post termination, and for how long that can be discussed. But these are very important clauses because if you miss that, the foundation is poor of any contract, right? So yes, so I think yeah, that's something that they can do it. But still, one more thing I would say, despite vendor due diligence or the TPAs or everything, it's important. See, every organization will know that what type of vendor you are dealing with, what type of data you're handing it over to them, or what is the sector that you're dealing right into, kind of data, whether it's a sensitive data or general data or the volume of data you have. Depending on that, the organization needs to take a call as to merely signing the SCCs and DPAs is going to be enough, or they must actively make sure that the vendors are applying some practical safeguards in place. That's what I will say last.
Got it. Yeah, I think this squarely answers one question that we had in chat earlier on, which was about if you outsource data to a foreign processor, then does that absolve you of liability? The answer is a flat no. It is your job to make sure that the vendor is processing data based on the required privacy requirements, consent requirements, and information security requirements. In fact, you also talked about how vendors create an information security risk where they can piggyback, where attackers can piggyback into your systems through that. And then you very graciously listed out a lot of the privacy clauses and the foundational clauses, risk management clauses, and liability clauses that should go into a contract. I think the best service of that would be to include that in our transcript, in our notes for this call, so that people get these very real nuggets to work with. So thanks a lot for that, Pooja. Shreya, again, talking about raising this within an organization, in a group entity setup, in different businesses, different sectors, the whole conglomerate starts moving towards compliance. And that would involve hundreds of contract reviews, updates, and closures. How do you even ensure that this is done in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable amount of people?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. With many big group companies where, managing hundreds of vendors, it can feel overwhelming at times. But what needs to, before we try to deep dive into it, what needs to be addressed is, do I need to keep the same intensity operations with or the checks with all of my vendors or not? That's where you need to have a more strategic and risk-based approach to identify where I need to prioritize even my contractual obligations on. So you start with identifying the vendors in general, like what I think Pooja also mentioned. You need to start with having a visibility on what are my common vendors. So even when you're talking in a group setup, many times some vendors have an overlap, they support the same services across the organization. So what you need to see is not every vendor needs the same level of scrutiny. So you start with identifying who are my high risk vendors. When I say that, it means generally, as per the global standards, you start with looking into the ones which are processing more volume of data or more in terms of classification, more sensitive or critical kind of personal data for you, right? Then you go to a medium risk where you can still, based on your internal policies or the general frameworks which are available, you can identify these vendors into these top three categories mostly. The second stage will be where you standardize your checks. Okay, so if you're my high risk vendor, these are the clauses of what Pooja talked about, and these are the checks I'm going to do for each and every high risk vendor. So your list becomes concise, at least when you start dividing them like this and putting them under different buckets. And the last step is, as I think in one of our chat we discussed, was continuous monitoring. You have to imbibe that into your, either you bring it contractually or you bring it as part of your policy practice, right? That each of your vendor has to adhere to those standards when they're delivering or processing anything on your behalf, because the liability, as we have talked about multiple times, lies with the data controller or the data fiduciary. So you cannot get away with that. What you can do is perform your due diligence, ensure these checks, identify your vendors, divide them into categories, and then move to the next step. So moving to the next step, when I say, as Pooja, I think, has mostly touched on majority of points on that, but that also, when we are managing a third-party risk at scale, contract is your first line of defense. Even in group setups, as I mentioned, it caters to more complex, because some vendors might be servicing multiple entities. So what you need to do is, you don't just, it's not just a standard data processing agreement, right? DPDP Act requires you to go beyond that. I can mention the sections. I hope everybody would be comfortable with it. But if you read through section 8, it makes it very clear that you, as a data fiduciary or an organization, remains liable. So you need contracts to go beyond just a boilerplate, right? What that means, you need to ensure that explicit purpose limitation, as Pooja has already pointed out, that the vendor can only use your data for the purpose that you have defined. They cannot go beyond that, and that needs to be agreed upon and put into contract with the help of clauses. When you talk about breach notification, it's not just that they have to notify you. You have to define the period, because you ultimately have to go and inform the authority. So you have to define that period with your vendor so that you can address your legal regulation with the authority, right? Again, deletion and all. How do I have a proof of it, whether they have deleted the data for me or not, right? Either it is post my engagement, or if a customer has asked for a deletion to any organization, right? So there is a good sense that you ask them to share deletion certificates with you after they have cleared out the data from their databases. Third would be, as Pooja has said, the sub-processor category. So what I need to put in as for managing my risk is, I need to give that as an approval cycle. Like, you cannot even onboard a sub-processor for my data without my approval. And that goes into your contract as a checkpoint. And finally, the most important part that I discussed earlier on this category, continuous monitoring. How do I do that? I bring the audit rights with me. So what I say is, even if I don't use them every day, the fact that I can demand proof from my third party or my vendor is the right that you need to have with you. Right? So that's the majority of portion when it comes to third party risk management. You need to define clearly who the data fiduciary is, who the processor is, right? It can have independent roles, it can have joint roles depending on the purposes, but that needs to be clearly recorded, because with them comes the obligations. Who's going to pay and who's going to be liable, who's going to be accountable for what. If it's a joint ownership, again, go beyond the simple clauses. Make sure that you have defined each and every role in joint ownership. This is where the vendor is responsible, this is where I'm responsible. And list down the data elements and purpose for each of them. It's a tedious task. Your legal would be more than happy to do it for you. But that's how you control risk, at least from contract point of view. And then from operational point of view, start having inventory, look into risk categorization, see how much volume of data is getting processed by whom, standardize your policies for each category of risk, and keep the audit rights with you. So you can go anytime and do an audit check with your vendor.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I think one very clear thing that is coming out of this discussion is these list of clauses that you can have, and we'll be very happy to share that with our audiences. Just a quick time check here. It's 12:59 p.m. and we have some stuff to talk about. We'll probably go a bit over. What we're going to do next, while we have Pooja and Shreya with us, is going to do 5 minutes for questions. So if there are any questions that have not been answered, please key them in and we will take them right now. I'll just take a couple of questions. One question was asked by Prasadu about, if the data is collected and then de-identified, and then that is breached, then is that also a breach of the DPDP Act? The DPDP Act concerns itself with personal data breaches. So if the data that is breached does not have any personal data in it, then you are safe, which is why de-identification, anonymization, all of these are really good technical strategies to minimize your risk. Like basically, if you don't need someone to have the data, then you can de-identify it, anonymize it, and share it with them. If they have to have it, let's say for a logistics partner, they should get access to data exactly at the time of delivery, and they shouldn't get access to it throughout. So you can orchestrate those flows internally to make sure that privacy by design basically is maintained. There's another question about if one data set contains both personal and non-personal data, how should it be classified during mapping? I think it contains personal data, so it is relevant for your data mapping purpose. Pooja, any point on that?
So ideally, so it depends on how the organization. So I'll tell you from a consultancy standpoint approach. So any organization that comes to us, ideally they ask is not just data discovery, but it's also data classification and then data mapping. So classification is very important because sometimes what happens is the industry may be dealing into personal data as well as sensitive data, the generic personal data and sensitive data. I do understand that the DPDP is right now not talking about sensitive data as such. However, it will come up with certain guidelines. I'm very sure about it. But does in that point, so classification is very important because you're going to put more security measures on it so that you have way less people who have access to the type of sensitive data that you're dealing with, and so that it's not exposed to the larger chunk of people in your or the employees in your organization. So classification plays a very important role if you're dealing into sensitive data. Yes, I hope that
Yeah,
answers.
yeah. And I think there's another question about someone's asking to explain privacy by design. And privacy, but I mentioned that word. It's basically the idea, very simply put, is that right when you design a business, when you start designing a product or any offering, you bake privacy into it. So you, at the idea stage itself, you have to assess the risks and incorporate mitigations and incorporate privacy into the design of your systems, into the design of your operations, rather than putting it on as a band-aid later. That's basically what privacy by design means. There's a question about what to do with a personal data breach. Entirely different topic. Pooja, could you give a brief answer on this, please?
Sure. Let me answer this basis. What is the ask from the DPDP rules, rather?
Yeah.
When you have a data breach, first of all, immediately notify your supervisors. Very important. Don't sit on it. Let me see how I can rectify. Let me see what I can do, work around it. Let me see if I can do this or that. No, just go and notify your supervisors. The stakeholders who are correctly appointed to do this work, they know the faster way and the better means to deal with that data, right? It's very important that you, first step, tell your supervisors, make sure your DPO knows. I'm sure there are policies in place in your organizations where they are telling you how to deal with it. So people who are processing the personal data, make sure that what are the policies around that, built around that for data breaches. Second is the DPDP ask is that now if this question is coming from somebody who is into the privacy governance team, then I would say that the DPDP ask is in two steps, I believe. So one is that you have to immediately notify the individuals and the authority. So without even gathering any data, do notify them that yes, we've observed that there's certain incident that has occurred. This is what the breach is. But to go into details, they're given you 72 hours, right? So within 72 hours, you can then collate all the data, try to understand, try to isolate that system. That's also one of the steps, that try to isolate that system so that the breach doesn't spread out more. So also that what I was saying, within 72 hours, you need to collate all the data and share it with the government body, the authority body, which will be here, I believe it's TPBIA. So once you have that body, you collate data and share it with them. So these are some of the status, but very important. Go and tell your supervisor. I've seen a lot of many times that people do not do that. They come to the supervisor after a day or two, and by the time that thing is spreaded to other system, we can definitely seize that initially.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you for that answer. I know that we can, with your expertise, we can go on talking about data breaches. Maybe we will do another session. Really inspired to do another session with you all where we deep dive, maybe in a different format. Instead of an overview thing, we can deep dive into gap assessment. We can deep dive into breach workflows. And so, what next? Just for the people who are still here, firstly, thank you so much. What we are going to do next is that we are going to dive into a demo. We were hoping to do a demo of the entire workflow using Consentin, so data discovery, gap assessment, and third-party contract reviews. But today we're already over time, and so what we'll do is we'll do data discovery and third-party contract reviews and gap assessment. Maybe if Pooja and Shreya are willing, we can have another session and maybe do a deep dive about gap assessments, and with that we can do a demo. So before I hand it over to Sid, just a note of thanks for Pooja and Shreya. I think thank you both of you for coming in with your really practical insights that are relevant to an organization, to a person that is listening to this webinar. I think initially I asked a question, what can compliance teams do? And you all have set a very good example of what a compliance person can do with like very clear organizational practical steps that can be taken within an organization to get moving towards DPDP compliance with a lot of insights and a lot of expertise. So thanks Pooja, thank you Shreya for coming in. I had a great time chatting with you all, and I hope you had a good time too in this.
Yes, thank you, Pushkal. Definitely, the pleasure is ours. It's good that we can spread that awareness. I'm sure Shreya seconds that, because the more we are aware, the more we can further advance. Because I believe it's high time now. We need to take care of the personal data.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pushkar. Thanks for setting this up because it's a good chance for us to move from reactive to proactive approach. And I think these kind of
Yeah.
sessions help people to also understand why it is important, what is critical, and how to manage things and not get overwhelmed by what is actually required from them. Hopefully they
Yeah,
got something that they can use. Yeah.
absolutely. And three of us were talking about this before. We all refer to a mindset change and a cultural change that comes in. And I think with this session, at least for me as a listener to your answers, like I think you've managed to give those tools and that cultural sort of mindset that can be incorporated in this session. So thank you so much. And without much further ado, I'll bring in Siddhant. So Siddhant is a head of product at Leegality, and he has been using AI really creatively to solve these critical problems, some of these critical problems that we've been talking about. Today, Sid is going to walk us through data discovery, a short demo for data discovery, as well as a short demo for AI assisted contract reviews. And yeah, over to you, Sid, from now.
Thanks, Pushkal, and thanks to our panelists, Shreya and Pooja. I think that was a very insightful conversation, lots of practical insights and tidbits. So, with that context, I think I'd love to dive into a very quick demo of our data discovery product first, which is called Lens. Pushkal, my screen is visible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Cool. Before we dive into the demo itself, I would just like to talk a little bit about the context and the kind of problems that it solves for you. At its essence, it is a data discovery tool that helps you identify PII across your various data sources. But in terms of key benefits for your business, the panelists already talked about it, but the first one is that it lays the foundation for your gap assessments. I think Pooja gave a very helpful analogy of an iceberg problem here, right? Where there is a lot of hidden data, a lot of companies don't know exactly what kind of data they have and what kind of PII they have. So with discovery, because you get a full bird's eye overview of what kind of data you have, that really lays the foundation for carrying out gap assessments and figuring out what kind of consents do you need to take, what kind of purposes do you need to add in your consent profiles, and where exactly are you using those data points and whether that's in accordance with the consents that you've taken, right? So this is a fundamental first step for any sort of gap assessments. Second, the panelists also talked about that once you do data discovery, you are now in a position to manage your data security posture. That there were interesting questions about anonymization and otherwise protecting the data. So when you do data discovery, you figure out where your PII data is, what data sources are highly risky, and that allows your teams and owners to appropriately take measures, right? So ensuring maybe deleting some data where it's not needed, which also has the benefit of reducing cost for you and reducing your surface area of risk, or alternatively ensuring there's appropriate encryption, tokenization, so on and so forth, right? And lastly, data discovery also helps in automating and fulfilling DSR requests with confidence. So one of the examples that Shreya talked about is that when there is a deletion request, you don't just need to delete data from your primary data source that is highly visible, like your CRM, but you also need to delete it from every single place where you have that particular principal's data, right? And you can confidently do that only when you catalog your entire data inventory and you know exactly where you have various kinds of PII. So data discovery via product like Lens also helps you achieve that, right? So those are the key benefits of the product. Broadly, we'll talk about what Lens can do for you. So Lens is designed to be completely comprehensive. So it covers all your data sources, from ranging from structured data like your core application databases to unstructured data, which includes files, images, etc., and even third-party SaaS data sources like your CRMs that may be on cloud, and eventually even endpoints, right? So any data that's lying in your mobile phones or laptops. The product that we have live right now, which is being implemented in industries, is the structured data source scanning, and the rest is something that's under development. But the product is designed to have full coverage for all of these data sources, right? So you have everything under a single platform. Secondly, often you'll find that when you want to perform data discovery, there are a lot of technical challenges that your technical teams may come up with, right? So technical teams may say that, hey, look, there is a lot of compute associated with this. It's very costly. It's very time consuming. The panelists did mention that sometimes these scans can take a lot of time. Our application is actually designed to take into account some of these business considerations. So your technical teams and your business teams will have the ability to run scans in a way that best suits your business needs and that helps you achieve a balance between compliance and flexibility, right? So for example, you can define which parts of the data source you want to scan. For example, if there are application logs, programmatic logs, where you're very sure you don't have PI data, you can just exclude that and therefore reduce your cost of scanning. We have different types of scans that are extremely comprehensive, where we scan every single value of file, but that's obviously more time consuming and more cost intensive. Alternatively, we have quick scans, smart scans, which allow you to scan only certain parts of data, but which very confidently can give you a prediction of whether or not you have PI in a particular data source, right? So there are a whole host of configurations like that, things that your technical teams will really love. So for example, we have capabilities to exclude scanning within peak business hours, right? Which your developers may really love because they don't want to have another resource intensive application running during peak business hours when, you know, or have any downside in terms of the performance experienced by your users, right? So all of these sort of business friendly configurations are available in the product. And lastly, the tool is entirely self-hosted and secure. So this is not a cloud solution. This is entirely in your environment. So no PII leaves your control. There's no PII coming to Leegality at all whatsoever. So that's another sort of key benefit of using this approach. Right now, with that said, I think I'll quickly skip to the demo itself. Pushkal, I hope the application screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, cool. So this is how the Lens dashboard looks like. The entire functionality is designed to be controlled via dashboard itself. You don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to have any technical chops to use this application, right? It's entirely user friendly and completely via dashboard interface. So broadly, you can see the kind of data scanning has been performed here. So the number of scans that we have performed, the number of PI instances detected, the number of data sources that you have scanned, and most importantly, you can see the data catalog, right? This is the end result of the scanning that happens on this application, right? And then you can see some scan logs as well, right? So there's a lot to go over in terms of individual components, but I'll focus today on the data catalog, which is the end result after the scanning process is done, right? So let's look at the data catalog here. So in the data catalog, you can see a very high level overview of what kind of PII you have and where is it located, right? So for example, we can see that we have almost 1.2 million instances of Aadhaar that we've detected in this database called DevDB cluster, right? So that's something that we can focus on. And you can see that distribution for each sort of PII type, right? And you can flip this up by looking at it by data sources. So you can see, okay, your DevDB cluster has a lower concentration of PII, whereas your other data source, which is internal Aurora, has a much higher PII instance count, right? Which means your teams can focus on the appropriate data source, on the appropriate data category, and first address those before moving to the other teams, right? And this sort of view also allows you to then approach the right stakeholders internally, approach the right owners internally to manage data security posture, right? So this is the high level overview that the catalog gives, but the benefits go beyond this. What you can do is you can deep dive on any single category or data source to look at things in even more detail, right? So let's, for instance, check out where we have email. So in email, when we drill down on email, we can see that this is the distribution, right? Internal Aurora has a lot more instances than DevDB cluster. So this is an area of focus. And you can even further drill down on any particular data source, right? So let's drill down on this data source called internal Aurora. Now here, this is the really interesting part, right? I would say this is what is a part of the iceberg that's not visible to you, right? So you have 58 instances of unique paths where email has been detected in this one data source, right? Typically, this is something that takes businesses by surprise, right? You would imagine that, of course, your contact book has an email field, and there you will definitely have email stored. But there are so many instances where you have email stored, right? For example, we have a path here called new production audit trail remarks. This column is just called remarks. It's not even called email, but you have email there, right? So this kind of visibility helps you come to a place where you can reliably and confidently then take appropriate actions, right? So you may want to delete some of this data if it's duplicate, reduce your surface area of risk, also reduce cost, right? And these are some of the things that you can talk to with your technical stakeholders to convince them to use a product like this, right? It also helps you confidently serve DSR requests, right? Because now if you get a deletion request, you need to ensure that email is deleted from all of these places, right? So without a tool like this, it's very challenging to confidently say that you are in compliance with the regulatory requirements, right? So that's an overview of the data catalog. It gives you a high level overview as well as a drill down of exactly where you have PII. And this is not even the last level of drill down, right? You can go even deeper. So let's say we want to look at this remarks column. Now we can see that, okay, which scans have we found emails here, and we can also see samples, right? So samples brings me to another unique feature of our application, which is that it puts privacy teams, legal teams, and individual teams in control of this process, because you are getting samples here for review, right? So you can see that, okay, even though we used AI and ML to detect PII, there's still somebody who can review these samples and decide whether the data is correct or not, right? So here we can see that, yes, in the remarks column, people have actually added their email IDs. So it's something that we need to definitely look out for. And this is a correct assessment. But in case something is wrong, your teams can fix it, right? So very quickly, I'd like to show that part of the application as well. So after each scan, we produce results for your teams to review. And there is a very helpful tree-based UI where you can see what kind of tables have what kind of PII and things like that. And you can drill down on any specific field to assess whether the data is appropriate here, right? So for instance, let's look at this mobile column. I click here, I can see that, okay, there are samples. Now, if I want, I can perform a review and change this finding if it's incorrect. And if it's good, then I can just hit confirm and publish, right? So that way, human teams are still in control, and there is a way for you to reduce false positives. So that's a way to balance the powerful capabilities that AI can bring in terms of detecting PI, whilst at the same time having legal teams and privacy teams in control of the overall process. So that should give you an overview of how the Lens product works. There's full customizability in terms of what kind of configurations you want, which we talked about. But I'll just pause for now since we are over time for questions, and then maybe we can look at the contract review tool as well. Are there any questions in the Q&A that we can take up?
Yeah, there's one question from Prasad. Will it scan only label of the database, or will it scan the entire data as well?
So that's a great question. The answer is that our application empowers you to do whatever you want, right? You can scan only labels. So we have a scan type called metadata scan that runs really quickly. That's only looking at database labels and column names and things like that. And that's really fast, right? That's very cheap as well. Won't cost you much compute. On the other hand, you can start looking at every single row in the database as well, or you can look at only a certain number of rows per table. So there's full flexibility for you. Whatever you want, depending on your risk posture, depending on your requirements, you can make it happen via Lens.
That's all. No more questions.
Cool, terrific. So let's move into the other product that we wanted to demo today, which is our third-party contract review tool called Deal Collaboration. So the panelists, I think, talked about a lot of risks that we should ideally look out for in the contracting stage. And I think the panelists laid down a number of different things to be mindful of. So that was very helpful. What this tool can help you do is it can help you define all of these rules that your legal team and your privacy teams have created and define a rule set, right? So let me take you to the rule set page of this application. So let's say, so here, for instance, we have a rule set created for data privacy assessment, right? And this rule set has all the rules that your legal teams and privacy teams would have created, right? So everything that the panelists talked about today can be saved here as a rule in this rule set, right? So for instance, we talked about data breaches. We have a rule here that the service provider must notify the client within 48 hours if there is data breach or security incident affecting any data, right? You have a rule here that service provider shall provide timely and reasonable assistance to client in fulfilling DSR requests. So any request for access, correction, deletion, etc. will be fulfilled by the client, right? So all those requirements from your teams can be added as rules here. And in addition to rules, you can also provide sample clauses here, right? So for example, you can add a suggested clause here, which is approved by your legal teams or privacy teams, that is as per your best practice. You can build your clause library here as well. Now, once you've created, these rule sets are then available for you during the contract review process, right? So let's take a look at how that works in practice. I'm just firing up a sample MSA that we have here, right? Now, typically, this is something that would be a manual process where the legal team is, or the business team, and every team that's involved in the contracting process, they'd be manually reviewing this contract to ensure compliance. But now with our AI-driven review process, you can check every contract against your data privacy assessment rule set, where we have all the various different types of rules defined, right? So all you need to do is open up this rule set by clicking on the AI review button and hit run. And now the models will get to work and they will assess each rule one by one. So let's see what the results look like. We have 4 sample rules here. You can add as many as you want, right? Okay, so we have 4 rules and we can see that the first rule is met, right? So data should be saved on servers in India. That was our first rule, right? And data should not be saved or transferred to servers outside India without the prior written consent of the client, right? So this is something that AI says is acceptable and it's met, and it's also pointing us to the relevant clause, right? And it's automatically scrolled us to the relevant place as well, right? So we can see that there is a rep here which says all data and documents generated as part of the services are stored in the boundaries of India, right? So we are good with this rule, right? Of course, if teams have issues with this, they can obviously change the document here on our online editor and then recheck compliance, right? But let's take a look at another rule, right? For instance, here we have a rule that says service provider must notify the client within 48 hours if there is a data breach or security incident affecting any data, right? Now here we have, there's a missing clause here because the contract does not specify a time frame for notifying the client about data breaches or security incidents, right? So here we can see that because this clause is missing, the AI is helping you in making that assessment, right? It's telling you that there is no specific timeline that is available for this notification, right? So let's look at the actual contract and what it says. It says that service provider should also review and monitor on regular basis and immediately disclose any breaches of security practice and controls or leakage of information. So it talks about disclosure, but only vaguely, right? Immediate. But we want, under the DPDP regime, we want in 48 hours, right? So that's not something that's mentioned. So that's again getting flagged by AI, right? And similarly, let's say we have a requirement that we need to flag DSR automations and we need to have enabling provisions in our contract for vendors to help us with DSR requests. That is also something that's missing. So AI is flagging that, right? So this helps you speed up your contract review process on the one hand, help your legal teams when there is we talked about conglomerates which have hundreds of contracts. So it helps legal teams and privacy teams speed up the review process. At the same time, it's also helping against omissions and issues just because of human error. Because again, the AI can just help you assess whether for this rule set are you in compliance or not, right? Where are you in compliance, where are you not in compliance? And then again, the process here is the humans are still in control. So you have an editor on the left, you can edit and make changes, but the AI is there to help you speed up the process and also have a more reliable process. So that's a quick demo of the AI review tool that can help you with some of the third-party risks that we spoke of.
So I think it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you for the people who stayed past the webinars. Time slot to look at the work that we're doing here. And if you want to talk to us more, we are happy to help. Even if it is just a conversation around DPDP compliance, do reach out to us. After this session, as we promised, we will be sharing a detailed FAQ as well as this slide, as well as a recording of the presentation. So thank you so much and have a good one. Bye-bye.